One. 1, 2, 3. Excellent.
Okay, and now we're live streaming. Okay, so are you taking attendance?
Yes. Mr. Alex Bunnan.
Present.
The Honorable Sharon Keller.
Here.
Representative Nicole Collier. Mr. Bunnan, we have quorum.
Okay, then first item is approval of the minutes.
I move to approve the minutes.
Okay, absent any discussion, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Then it passes. Okay, so that takes us to our main item. Jeff, you're going to start.
Sure thing, Mr. Bunnan. Welcome, everybody. So we only have one item today, and that's to come back to you with some information about indigent screening and indigent standards. We have a PowerPoint prepared for that, so Kristen's going to pull that up. Can you all see that okay? Okay, great. So you remember that SMU's Deason Center, Professor Metzger and Dr. Andy Davies came and presented about indigent screening standards last time this committee met. And this committee tasked us with the staff with going and doing additional research and coming up with some potential options for indigent screening. And that's what we're doing here today. Next slide. So basically, we've got three things for you today. One is just going over some indigent screening basics, just explaining how it works. Parts of it are a little bit complicated. Most of it isn't too bad, but we'll walk through all that. We'll talk about some of the problems that SMU identified in Texas, as well as some of the issues that we've seen through our policy monitoring. And then we'll talk about potential solutions as well as staff recommendations and have some time for discussion. And I think we scheduled this for an hour and a half. I don't believe we'll need all that time. I think this presentation total is probably 20 or 30 minutes maybe. And then of course, time for discussion after that. So we hope to get you all out of here early. Next slide. So let me turn it over to Kristen. Kristen's the main attorney on staff who's been doing a lot of research on indigent screening. She's been looking at this across the state, but also looking at it nationally. So I'm going to turn it over to her to talk about indigent screening basics. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. Hello, committee members. So let's start with the very, very basics of who is indigent. Well, in Texas, indigent is defined as a person who is not financially able to employ counsel. And that's according to Article 1.051B of the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure. So it's not someone who necessarily is the most worst off in society, but just someone who's not able to financially employ counsel. With that being said, I'm going to go over kind of the two main approaches that we see people using to measure indigence. The first of those is going to be income-based, so some sort of measure of income that a person makes and kind of picking some threshold that says, okay, if you make over a certain amount, then you're not considered indigent. The second approach to indigence standards that we usually see is what we're calling what's called an indigence presumption. So this kind of presumption is when a court presumes that someone is indigent based off of some specific factor. Now, kind of a couple of common ones that we've seen both across the nation and across Texas are when someone is institutionalized. So that means when someone is incarcerated or if they're residing in a public mental health institution. Another really common one we see is when someone is receiving public benefits. And so that's kind of the two main approaches we see when people are looking at how to measure indigence. But one important thing to note here is that these two approaches are not used standing alone usually. Usually they're kind of, most counties use them in conjunction with each other. And so there's kind of several different standards that people use when they're measuring indigence. Digging a little bit deeper into income, we're going to spend a little more time on income than we will with presumptions, just because it's a little more complicated and there's a couple different ways people use to measure income. So the first measure that a lot of counties use, this is used in most counties in Texas, is going to be the federal poverty guidelines. Now, the federal poverty guidelines are the official measure of poverty in the United States, but they're based only on the cost of food. They don't take into consideration any other essential expenses that you need to survive, things like housing or transportation and things of that nature. Now, the federal poverty guidelines, it's one flat rate across the entire nation. So it doesn't take into account any cost of living, which means it's not really tailored to individual costs based on where you live. The other thing about federal poverty guidelines is actually the Census Bureau, who's the one who's part of the federal government with those guidelines, really views them as a statistical yardstick rather than a complete description of what a family needs to actually make ends meet. Now, the second approach that we've seen in quite a few places is what Tarrant County uses and in their district courts, and that's based off of the living wage calculator. Now, this type of model uses a kind of basket of essential goods, so things like housing, transportation, food, healthcare. It takes that kind of basket of essentials and it says, okay, you need to have these things just to survive. And you need a certain amount of these based on the size of your family. But then it goes one step farther. Then it also says, let's take a look at the cost of living at the county level. So it's a localized measure of what it takes to make ends meet. And so that's the second kind of measure that we see when it comes to income-based indigence. We're going to dig a little deeper. Let's just talk generally who can afford counsel. This is really hearkening back to the definition of indigence here in Texas, which is a person who is unable to financially afford to employ counsel. This answer is going to be a little more complicated depending on the situation, because if you're a single person, your expenses are inherently going to be less than if you are a family of 4 people with dependents. So let's walk through a couple scenarios here just to put some numbers to these scenarios. So first off, if you're a single person, no dependents, how much do you need to make ends meet? What would make you be able to afford counsel? Is it $30,000 a year? Is it 25, 20? Let's walk through a sample budget just to kind of see where things stand based off of cost of living. Now, since we're doing a cost of living analysis, we had to pick a county somewhere here in Texas, and we picked one that was kind of middle of the road, not too urban, not too rural. So we're going to be doing a cost of living budget for Brazos County. So looking at a budget, basic monthly expenses, you've got your food, you've got housing, no childcare because you have no dependents, right? But you do have healthcare, transportation, other costs that kind of go in there. So that monthly expenses total for a single person living in Brazos County is going to be almost $2,700 a month. Now, when you look at that number and you bring it out to an annual expenses total, that means that just to make ends meet, you have to be spending nearly $32,000 a year just to meet those basic expenses. And when you compare that with kind of annual incomes, depending on how much you're making, you'll see that you need to make certainly over $15 an hour if you're working full-time every single week with no breaks. So this kind of puts in perspective a little bit how much money someone needs to survive as a single person. Let's go ahead and compare that to the federal poverty guidelines and see where you land on that percentage scale. So for a single person, you'll see based on the federal poverty guidelines, you've got the gross income over here. You'll see that, for example, just kind of highlight a couple of these. The federal poverty guidelines at 125%, that's the most common percentage used across the state of Texas by counties. That threshold is going to be almost $17,000. So a court will look at it and they'll say if they're using that 125% and you make over this $16,988, they'll say you're not indigent based on an income measure. And that's really not that much money when you look at the budget we just went through. And if you move a little higher up the scale, say to 200%, you'll see it's just over $27,000. And even that doesn't quite get you to the amount of the sample cost of living budget we walked through for Brazos County. Now that we've looked at kind of what a single person needs to make ends meet and compared those against the federal poverty guidelines, let's go to a different scenario. Let's look at a family of 4. You've got dependents, you got kids. How much does a family of 4 need to make ends meet? 60,000? Maybe 40,000? Let's run through another budget. Again, in Brazos County, kind of a middle of the road. Let's look at how much it costs just to meet those basic needs. Got kind of the same basic needs here, food, housing. You have childcare this time because 1, you have children, and 2, you've got working adults in the home. So that monthly expenses total for Brazos County is going to be over $7,000 a month. And if you have 2 adults working full-time, those annual incomes based on a per hour rate, no weeks off, you'll see kind of how much they can make in a year. When you compare that with their annual expenses total, it takes a lot to raise a household, to support and care for your family and your kids. And so keeping this in mind, let's go ahead and go back to those federal poverty guidelines and see kind of where this aligns. So for a family of 4, federal poverty guidelines, again, I'm going to return us back to that 125%. And that's because that's the most common one used across the state of Texas. And you'll see that it's not even $35,000 a year. So if you have a family of 4 and one of you is facing some sort of charge, then if you make over $35,000 a year in Texas, then you're not considered indigent based on an income measure. And that's not a lot to meet all of those expenses for a family. And then if we move up a little higher, you can see again at the 200% level, you're just over $55,000 a year. And so this kind of puts those income numbers, those percentages, it puts them in perspective against each other. And that's kind of a valuable place to start when it comes to indigence measures based on income. Now, there's one other piece to consider here, and that's that second model that we talked about, right? So we talked about federal poverty guidelines and then that Tarrant County model. So let's go ahead and compare the federal poverty guidelines to the Tarrant County model and see how those align with each other. One thing to keep in mind, and just as a reminder, the federal poverty guidelines are flat across the nation. There is one number depending on the number of people in your household. It's not localized at all. So every county's number is going to be exactly the same. The Tarrant County model takes into account that local cost of living. And since it's going to take into account the local cost of living, different counties are going to have different numbers of what you need to basically make ends meet in those counties. With that, let's go to the single person. You have no dependents. We just kind of pulled a sampling of counties, some more rural than others, some more urban than others. But you'll see here that if you look at the Tarrant County model, every county's cost of living is a little different. The cost of making ends meet as a single person in, say, Dallas County, a big urban location, is a little different than the cost of living in Borden County. But one thing that you should take note of here is not just the local cost of living, but also comparing the Tarrant County model to the different percentages of the federal poverty guidelines. You'll see that there's a pretty big gap, even at 200% of the federal poverty guidelines, between the income that the federal poverty guidelines say you need to make ends meet versus that Tarrant County model, which is based off that basket of goods, those basic essentials you need. Now you'll see similarly here, this is also the case for the family of 4 model. Again, if you're a family of 4 in Lynn County, you're going to need a different amount of income to make ends meet than Harris County. And again, you'll see that big gap between federal poverty guidelines and the Tarrant County model. And just to point out, once again, the most common model we see in Texas is that 125%. And with that, we're going to move on from the income-based models to looking at indigence presumptions. And I'm going to turn it over to Wesley to do that.
Thanks, Kristen. So we got one slide on indigence presumptions, and Kristen already touched on these, so I won't take too much more time, but the idea with these is they act independently from the income test. And a lot of jurisdictions use them as a quick automatic qualifier when they're doing the interview to determine who qualifies for counsel. The idea being, if one of these factors is in place in your situation, you're presumed not to be able to hire counsel, and the court will go ahead and appoint counsel. So it's a way to make it a little bit easier, if you will, to rely on these factors. So the first one is being institutionalized, which generally is being incarcerated or a resident of a public mental health facility. You're presumed not to be able to retain counsel. This is common across the state and the indigent defense plans, as is the second one, which is qualifying for public benefits. So if you already qualify for a means tested benefit, such as public housing or TANF or food stamps, we can rely on that generally. And that this is, like I said, is most plans across the state. If you already qualify for those programs, you're presumed not to be able to retain counsel. The next one is remaining incarcerated for some number of days without counsel. And the idea there is, if maybe when you came into jail, you had a job, but if you're still in jail 2 weeks later, 1 week later, there's different timelines that jurisdictions use. They'll often go back and appoint counsel to those folks because at that point they can assume they're not going to be able to retain counsel. And this also catches some arrestees who maybe didn't request counsel initially. Perhaps they thought when they were brought before that magistrate that they wouldn't need counsel, that they were going to be able to hire their own. Well, if they were still in jail sometime later, that's generally presumed that they won't be able to. And then the last two are being a disabled person or being someone who's over 65 years of age. And these are common qualifiers for many means-tested public benefits programs, but are at the moment not typically used in determinations of indigence for appointment of counsel purposes. But these are two other ones that fall into that automatic qualifier or indigence presumption category. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jeff.
And actually, Kristen, if you could go back one slide real quick, there's one other point that, and I think Wesley, you said this the right way, but there's something that Mr. Bunnan and Judge Keller just to flag for you all, that receiving public benefits, even though we have the word receiving there, Wesley and Kristen, my recollection is it's actually just eligibility for those benefits in a lot of the plans. Is that accurate?
That's right. And that's actually what's in our PIDC template for indigence determination section of the indigent defense plans is eligible for. So
Gotcha.
We don't want to effectively punish people because they haven't gotten their act together to apply for a public benefit for which they qualify, is the idea with the eligible versus already receiving.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you. Kristen, if you can go to the next slide. So problems, so that these are, I've just got a couple slides on this. And these are a combination of problems that SMU identified, as well as issues that our policy team members, and I think we have everybody from the policy team here today, except for Bill Cox, that basically these are things that either SMU has identified or our policy team has seen over the course of policy monitoring. So potential problems with what we have right now. The first problem, and this really helps kind of inform the rest of them, is that we have about 400 different standards operating right now across the state of Texas. Every state in the United States, I think we're down to about 4 or 5 that don't have a uniform standard statewide, and Texas is one of those. Instead of one standard, we have close to 400, and so you might ask, how do we have 400? We have 254 counties, but many of those counties use a different standard depending on whether it's felonies or misdemeanors. So it's slightly different standard for each of those counties based on the level of charge. Many of the standards over time have become pretty complex, and I'll show you an example of that in just a couple of minutes. As a result of that, many are hard to apply. Our staff, especially Olivia and Joel, have been working with this indigent defense coordinators group statewide. And in fact, we just did a kind of a neat publication they put together to help support those indigent defense coordinators. And one of their big complaints is that it's become kind of unwieldy at this point to apply a lot of the standards. A lot of times we're seeing delays in proceedings. A lot of those delays result from, I think, Kristen, you had flagged that some of the income standards are pretty low. So what we see is somebody coming in with, say, $17,000 or $18,000 income. So it's they make enough that they're not qualifying for counsel, but in reality, they're not making enough to actually hire an attorney. So when they're screened, they're told you can't get an attorney, you make too much, you make 18,000 or 19,000, and then they sit in jail for a day, several days, several weeks, sometimes several months. And after days or weeks or months have passed, the judge or the court personnel say, well, it looks like you can't afford counsel, we're going to appoint an attorney anyway. Over the course of that time, we see multiple resets. So it's kind of gumming up the works a little bit in terms of efficiency as well. Next slide.
And one thing to point out on the delayed proceedings is the delay happens whether or not you are in jail, because if you're out and you're still only making that limited amount of income where you're not eligible, but you also really can't afford to retain an attorney. We've seen out in our policy monitoring, people have court dates reset and reset, trying to encourage them to go retain counsel because they're not considered eligible to get an appointed attorney. But when at the end of the day, really, they can't afford one.
It's a good point. Next slide. So because we've got 400 different standards, one of the things we're hearing a lot from IDCs is that it's become kind of unpredictable and unclear. If I'm an indigent defense coordinator in, say, Bell County, and an issue comes up, I can't just call my counterpart in McLennan County because they actually have different standards. So it's a little bit difficult for the court personnel to predict how things are going to play out. If you're in multiple counties, there's some judges who cover multiple counties. A lot of times we have different standards from county to county. You may remember from the SMU presentation, they had a good example. I think it was outside of Amarillo. No, I think it was outside of Abilene, actually, where they showed two different counties that are right next door to each other. And my recollection is that one had 125% of the poverty guidelines. The one right next door had 200%, which is a pretty big gap. So we don't have a lot of predictability. We don't have a lot of clarity. As Kristen was pointing out, we don't always have compliance with Article 1051B. Again, the test there is really just, can you afford to hire an attorney? And you get to some point with the federal poverty guidelines where it's low enough that, again, you may not qualify based on the federal poverty guideline percentage, but you're still not making enough to actually hire an attorney. It makes tech solutions difficult. It doesn't make them impossible, but it doesn't make them a lot harder when you have about 400 different standards. We have had a little bit of success in this area, actually, thanks to Kristen. We've helped automate the process in a couple different counties. In addition to that, TechShare has a decent solution that they've been able to use in a few different counties. But those have had their limits because every time you're doing that, you're kind of tailoring that to a new county. So having 400 different standards is kind of tricky in that sense. And then lastly, the delay for out-of-county arrests has been kind of tricky. One of the things we've seen a lot with policy monitoring. So if an alleged offense is in one county and you're arrested in a different county, there are laws around appointing counsel there, but it becomes kind of difficult because the two counties oftentimes have different standards. So that's just a high-level discussion of some of the problems we see. So some of these are ones that SMU identified. Some of these are ones that our staff has seen over the course of policy monitoring. Next slide. So this is an example just to give you some sense. I didn't want to put the whole thing, but we don't expect you to read this slide. But just to give you some sense of how unwieldy some of these indigent screening standards have become, this is a section of El Paso's indigent screening standard. This is paragraph 1 out of 19. So this is roughly 1/19 of the standard for the state of El Paso. This really is just the definition section. That's it. So you can imagine starting to apply these in reality, and one of the reasons we're getting this complaint from indigent defense coordinators is that the standards have kind of come up pretty organically from place to place and have become kind of unwieldy. And again, they're not even really able to compare notes with other counties because the standards are quite different from county to county. Next slide. So this is just a recap of SMU's recommendations. They're a little bit, it's a little more involved than what we're recommending on the staff side, but we thought it was worth just bringing up the SMU recommendations, reminding you what they talked about last time. They recommend a statewide standard, which would bring us into line with most of the states across the United States. They recommend considering a local cost of living type model like the Tarrant County model. Tarrant County, again, is based on the living wage calculator. The benefits and drawbacks I think we saw on the staff side, the benefit is that That Tarrant County model, if you applied it statewide, it does actually consider the cost of living in each county. So it factors in that living in Harris County is very different from living in Culberson County, is very different from living in Bell County. So that's a big benefit. The one big downside that we saw in the staff is that to apply that statewide would be a pretty big change from where we're at right now. Tarrant County is using that for the district courts. Lubbock County was using that for some of their county courts, but I don't believe they are anymore. So although it's a good model and it's got a lot of benefits, that's one of the big drawbacks we saw on the staff side is it'd be a really significant change, I think, for most Texas counties. They recommended including presumptions for incarceration and public benefits. Mostly Texas is already doing this on a county by county basis. There are some that are not, but the vast majority have presumptions for incarceration or for public benefits already. They recommended protecting essential assets. And this is something that I don't think we're seeing, and Wesley, correct me if I'm wrong on this, and Kristen, same thing. I don't think we're seeing right now in any Texas county, to my knowledge. But basically protecting essential assets, what they're talking about is saying, hey, don't consider the house, don't consider the car, don't consider some of those basic assets that a person might have. Again, maybe a good model, but it's one that's not really being used in much of Texas right now. And then lastly, they recommended a holistic assessment of income, assets, and expenses with the cost of retaining counsel. So that's just a summary of the SMU recommendations. Next slide. So what this committee tasked us with was to come up with options and potential recommendations for indigent screening. So we listed a few options. On this slide, I'll talk about some options for income standards. These are not the only options. I mean, I think there are other options, and I think it warrants some discussion to talk about where this committee and ultimately where the board wants to go with this. But this, I think, gives you at least a good sense of kind of the world of possibilities here as far as income standards. The next slide, we'll talk about presumptions as well. So, but first, let me talk about the income standards. We have three potential options here. And again, you're not limited by these three options. The first one is that Tarrant County standard, which again is based on the living wage. Basically, the benefit here is that it does account for the fact that it costs something different to live in Dallas County or Harris County than it does, say, in Bell County or McLennan or Culberson or Jeff Davis. So that's a big benefit. The one thing we really wanted to flag, though, is that it would be a really significant change because we only have one county that's currently doing that. The second option we outlined is federal poverty guidelines at 200%. 200% of the federal poverty guidelines, I think you saw the numbers before in Kristen's slides. A few different benefits here. One is that this would bring Texas closer to what it actually costs to hire counsel. That below this number really is, I think, as you saw from the numbers, and we can go back to the numbers if you all want to as part of the discussion, but then from the numbers you saw from Kristen, that less than this, it really is pretty darn difficult to actually hire an attorney. But the other reason that the staff, I think, really liked this option is that if you're comparing the income standards and the presumption standards, this would roughly bring the income standards in line with public benefits. So the reason that a lot of places presume that if you are receiving or eligible for public benefits, that you already qualify for counsel, the reason most counties in Texas and most counties across the United States use that presumption is that somebody else has already done the screening for you in some way. You've already had the defendant actually go through some other process. They've screened for their assets, and we have some good sense about whether they qualify. Usually that kind of screening is roughly in line with 200% or sometimes a little bit more than that. So the 200% would really kind of bring in the income standard and the presumption standard for public benefits kind of in line with one another. The last option that we presented, and again, you all aren't limited by these options, but would be federal poverty guidelines of but 150%. So this is a little bit lower. The benefit to this one is that this is roughly in line with what the current practice is across Texas today. Half or more of the counties are at 125% or a little bit more than that. So this is roughly in line. Of course, it is a little bit lower than the 200%. So out of these, the staff recommendation would be 200% of the federal poverty guidelines, for the reasons that we talked about. But again, you're not limited by these options. Let me pause there, and then we can maybe just go to the presumptions, and then we're happy to go back through the PowerPoint if it's helpful to walk through options and things like that. But Kristen, if you go to the last slide, which is the presumptions. So again, the presumptions, when the income standards and the presumptions, these usually work kind of hand in hand in most counties. The vast majority of counties in Texas and nationally use a combination of both. The presumption is, as Wesley was saying, these are basically saying, you know, we automatically presume that you're indigent because of some status of some sort. The first one is it being institutionalized. So this could be either incarcerated or it could be somebody that is in a mental health institution or something similar. This is already near universal in Texas. The vast majority of counties already do this. So the staff recommendation would be to create that as part of a standard. That really wouldn't be too big of a change from the current practice. Same thing with receiving public benefits. That's near universal already across the state and across the nation. So staff recommendation there too would be to create that as a standard. This one, let me slow down and talk about this for a little bit because this one's slightly different. Defendant remains incarcerated for 11 days without retaining private counsel. This is very common across the state, and perhaps even in the vast majority of counties. The reason I want to slow down on this one is that this one is not in most indigent defense plans. This really is, while it's pretty common, it's happening really kind of de facto, where a defendant is sitting in jail for a certain number of days, they're attempting to hire counsel, that doesn't happen, there's a reset, there's another reset, and eventually they end up having to appoint counsel. So the staff recommendation would be to include that. Again, it's a common practice throughout Texas, but I did want to flag that it's not in most of the indigent defense plans, and so that would be a little bit of a change. The last two presumptions I want to talk about, we don't have as strong of a staff recommendation on these, in part because they're not as common across the state of Texas. Being disabled, this is one that I believe was an SMU recommendation. While there are benefits to that and there is some logic behind it, and there could be some benefits, it's not that common across the state right now. And same thing for 65 years or older, that while there could be some benefits there, it's not that common across the state right now. So I think that's it, but let me pause. Wesley and Kristen, do you have anything to add to the problems we walked through or the options we outlined?
Nope, I think that you covered it.
Okay. Wesley and Kristen, anything else you want to touch on before we open up for discussion? Okay. Mr. Bunnan, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, well, I use my ability to ask questions, and the living wage calculator in Tarrant County. So I realize it's not used other places. Have you looked into what would be required to make it available to other counties?
Yeah, Kristen, do you want to talk about that?
Sure thing. So the Tarrant County model, this kind of cost of living based standard, it's available online already, and there are actually existing tech solutions that have that programmed as an option. So for example, TechShare, they have a indigent defense model, and that includes the determination of eligibility for counsel and the appointment of counsel. And as part of that model, they include both the option for federal party guidelines as well as the living wage standards. That's kind of already exist in some solutions to roll out across various counties.
Yeah, but I mean, I assume not all, well, we know not all counties have TechShare, and there are probably counties that don't, if you told them they needed to do this, they might not have the wherewithal to do it without some help. So I'm just wondering, are there costs involved? Would there be somebody to provide technical assistance to make it available?
Yeah, and you make a great point. There's kind of a few different ways that counties already implement their indigent standards. Some of them are much more technical than others. And so there's the ability to, since this kind of Tarrant County model is available online with that local cost already plugged in, there would be the ability to, pull that down from online and implement it in something as simple even as a spreadsheet, like an Excel spreadsheet, which I know a lot of counties use to help them with their indigent defense process.
And then my other question is, was there any review of costs of the case itself. So if you had a complex case, is there any difference in that? So I mean, this would be applied to misdemeanors, felonies, pretty much across the board. My experience is the more complicated a case is, the harder it is to go find and hire a lawyer. In fact, when I was a federal public defender, we had a high percentage of cases appointed to us with people that actually had jobs and things like that. But because the cases were so serious and because to hire a lawyer in federal court cost so much, they were often appointed counsel.
Yeah. Well, that's, I mean, there were a couple thoughts on it. One is that, yeah, if you look at Article 1051B, as you said, the test really is, you know, can you afford to hire an attorney? And in fact, if you look at Gideon and its progeny, the only time they really use the word indigent is when they're overruling past decisions. Really, the decision is really kind of centered on this question: can you afford an attorney? And as you point out, Mr. Bunnan, that your ability to afford an attorney really varies sometimes based on whether it's a felony or a misdemeanor case. And in fact, that's why we have 400 different standards at this point across Texas, is that many of those counties have multiple standards depending on whether it's felony or misdemeanor. I mean, one of the things that this committee and ultimately the board could do is adopt something different for felonies than we do for misdemeanors. So that would be an option. Jumping back to what you'd asked about before with the Tarrant County model. Yeah, I mean, you know, since TextShare already has that built in, on the one hand, there's some availability, and TIDC has helped fund TextShare in different counties that have adopted it. So there's a little bit of a barrier there because it would cost money. I think the bigger barrier really is just the practice. I think having people adapt to a different model, you know, living wage calculator is somewhat different in practice, I think, from federal poverty guidelines as far as the screening and everything. And I think that's what makes it kind of a big change.
Judge Keller, do you want to ask some questions?
Yes, I do. Thanks. And thanks, Kristen, and everybody who worked on this. I know a lot of work went into it, and there's a lot of really good stuff in here. My first question is, are we talking about adopting a rule to require the counties to do this, or how would it be implemented?
So I think I mean, ultimately it's up to this committee and to the board. But you know, 79034 of the government code gives the board the ability to promulgate something like that. I think on the staff side, our thinking would be, you know, maybe doing a floor of some sort, and counties could go beyond that if they wanted to.
What is it, 79 what?
That's 79034 of the government code.
Oh, government code, I don't have that handy. Well, I would first of all question whether we do have the authority to require counties to adopt one of these guidelines, but that's not my big issue. I have a lot of small issues, and the big issue is when the task force was created, there was kind of a promise that counties could run their own business and appoint counsel, and as long as they adopted a way to appoint counsel, they could choose what they wanted, and these kinds of decisions we left to the counties. So I'm reluctant to back off of that for a couple of reasons. One is that when we heard from the people at SMU, who did also a really great presentation, I can't remember the number of counties they said were doing things questionably, but by far the majority of counties were. I said, does that mean 200 and however many counties are doing fine? They said, well, we don't want to say they're doing fine, but essentially they were. So I think the idea of adopting a statewide standard is maybe problematic, at least questionable. Do we know why Lubbock stopped using the living wage calculator?
No, not for certain, but it was Judge Mark Hawker, if you remember him, and we can certainly call him and find out why they stopped using it.
And do we know how much this would end up, do we have any idea how much this would end up costing counties to implement either the 150 or the 200?
Not a really clear idea. I mean, we can do some additional math on this and try to figure that out. I think we could use some counties as sample counties and be able to project that. So if that's something that y'all wanted us to do, we could certainly try to come up with a number for that.
I would think that would be an important thing to do before we take any final action.
Sure.
I can't remember now, are any of the counties in Texas using the 200% of the federal poverty guidelines?
Yeah, and then Wesley, I think we might have that in the written materials for the meeting book. Did we include that,
so.
Wesley?
Yes, so two things. One, on kind of the previous question, we did talk with Tarrant County, who's using that kind of living wage model in their district courts. And when you looked at what they were doing beforehand, they were one of the numerous counties who used 125% of the federal poverty guidelines. And we asked them, hey, like, what does your appointment rates look like when you switched from 125% to this kind of living wage model? And the difference, a 3-year average difference, before, when they're using 125%, it was 81% appointment rate on the felony side. And then when you looked at the 3-year average when they were using that Tarrant County model they're in now, it was 83%. So it's only a 2% difference. So it's kind of catching the extras there. With regards to the last question that you asked, Judge Keller, the counties that are using the kind of 200 or more percentile so far, it's not the vast majority. It's a much smaller number of counties, as the majority are using the 125%, but there's a pretty significant number that use over 125%, for example.
Okay. Do you know what the most common standard is across the country? Is it 125%?
Give me one moment.
Yeah, across Texas, it's 125%. Across the country, I don't know, but Kristen might have that. Well, Judge, while Kristen's looking for that, yeah, we definitely talked about I mean, I think you bring up a good point. The commission has been, pretty cautious and a lot of times with good reason when it comes to creating any sorts of standards. 7903-4 gave the commission really broad authority in that when it comes to creating standards. And I think we've only really exercised that authority, and the commission's exercised that authority, I think just twice over the past 20 years. I think once was to require 6 hours of CLE. The other one was the contract rules.
Okay.
So we definitely were mindful of that, and that this is something that is not that we wouldn't want to jump into very lightly. But thought it was still worth talking about given the the problems that we're seeing, and that a lot of it is just problems in terms of the actual application of these 400 different standards, where the variation, again, just problems with predictability, problems with clarity, problems with applying this thing, because you can't turn to your neighbor and say, well, how do you do it, very easily. So we thought it was still worth talking about, especially given the SMU report.
I agree. I'm tending to think that this might be, if this is such a good idea and it streamlines things, that it might be that we could make some kind of a presentation to the different counties and let them decide whether it's a good idea or not, taking into account whatever their local concerns are. Because if it's not going to require a lot more appointments, and it streamlines things and it's easier, I think counties should want to adopt it or adopt something that works more smoothly. Let me jump off of that topic for just a minute and talk about the presumptions for appointment of counsel. And
Sure.
so would one of the presumptions be institutionalized? Means institutionalized in what? Not just jail?
Yeah, so it varies, and Kristen could probably speak to it more knowledgeably than I can, but generally what we're talking about is somebody who is incarcerated or somebody who's in a mental health institute or something like that. But Kristen or Wesley, anything you want to add to that?
But let me ask, so somebody who's incarcerated, you're not just talking about somebody who's been arrested and is in jail. You're talking about somebody who's in prison? Because that's a big difference.
Right.
Yeah, that is different, Judge. And typically, yes.
Okay.
So there's usually follow-ons, as we talked about, when someone remains in jail without counsel to a point. But yes, if they're right off the bat.
And what does disabled, what constitutes disabled?
Well, usually disabled, and we don't see this too terribly often in indigent standards context, but more so in public benefits context. So it's usually something that would be equivalent to you're disabled, and so that's eligibility for you to receive a public benefit.
Okay, because I know people who have been declared way after the fact to have PTSD from their time in Vietnam. And would that be considered disabled? I mean, they get disability payments from the military or disability benefits from the military.
I think it's just being generically here, and you could have a more definite description.
Okay. Well, let me just say that if I ever get arrested, I hope I'm in Harris County so Alex and his gang can represent me, because I would be presumptively eligible for appointment counsel. So I'll try to
Hopefully
do
we
that,
can get you a bond too.
Let me see what else I had to say.
But I think that the reason why the 11-day presumption is there is because that covers people who simply didn't make bail, as
Yeah.
opposed to being institutionalized, which means, you're being represented by state counsel for offenders. It's usually
Yeah.
those kind of cases. So
You know, I don't really have a problem with most of this. The problem I have is us imposing it on counties. Do we have any idea? I mean, I know it sounds like the indigent defense coordinators are all in favor of it. Do we know what county commissioners, county judges might think? The trial judges?
No, and in fact, we talked about that and we thought it better to hold off until after this meeting to, in fact, I have not talked to, and I really do want to talk to, like, for instance, Jim Allison, John Dayhill, and some folks with the counties and maybe some county judges about this.
I mean,
Okay.
I think of it as guidance as opposed to an imposition, because these things, even the presumptions, they're just presumptions. There could be other circumstances to consider. And, this is like a floor. They still can consider other things. And maybe, I mean, if there's a lot of pushback to this, if you simply had a model plan that you could offer people, most of them would go, oh, okay, we'll do that. I mean,
I tend to agree. I think if this is a good idea, then the counties should want to adopt it for all the reasons that are listed in this report. And I think we will get pushback. I think we'll get a lot of pushback. And on our ability, our authority to impose it, and on the imposition, the kind of bait and switch from 20 years ago, although those people are all gone, so maybe not. But I think the counties are going to resent us imposing this on them unilaterally. But I'm with Alex. And we've always done this, if you make something the easy way to go and offer help implementing it, and counties tend to adopt it.
And there are kind of two questions in there. One is, and Wesley, if you don't mind, you can post in the general chat for everybody. I think the authority part's pretty clear. The question, as you point out, Judge, is whether to exercise that. 79.34, I think, pretty clearly gives the authority. But there are other ways to, we kind of kick this around on the staff side too, that it could be a standard. We could, the board could set it as kind of a floor, as Alec, Mr. Bunning was saying, and allow counties to go anywhere they want beyond that. There's a possibility of doing it as more like a guideline.
Is that what you were saying, Alex?
yeah, I mean, give them the freedom to provide even more, ability to have counsel.
But were you saying set this as a floor?
It could be.
Okay, I didn't understand you to say that, but that's what Jeff heard.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. I mean, I'm for, I'm on the extreme end. I think anybody who needs counsel should get it. And, we shouldn't quibble about, their ability to pay if it clearly appears they can't pay. I mean, people aren't just going to sit in jail and wait for the court to appoint a lawyer. They need to get it as soon as possible. So I'm at the end of it where I would love for this to be imposed, but I agree with you that there's going to be pushback, and we may need to do something in a different way.
Okay, so I'm not opposed to most of what's in here, although I will say, if it takes 200% of the federal public, whatever they're called, poverty guidelines, to actually meet the requirement of appointing counsel to indigents, that would mean most of our counties are failing to appoint counsel when it's constitutionally required, and I don't think that's true. So I guess the numbers are, I mean, I don't know why the numbers came out one way, but isn't that what that would mean? That the ones that are 125% would be failing in their constitutional obligation?
Well, I would say kind of sort of, except that I think there's presumptions, you know, again, like if you're public benefits and things like that, that's catching a lot of people. So you
Right.
do get some folks who are not getting caught by those presumptions, and are maybe, you know, 125 and 200% makes a bigger difference in those cases. But those presumptions, you know, because it is kind of a shortcut to indigency, you know, and the other way the presumption really works out, Judge, is that if you're a county that is at 125% and somebody doesn't qualify for counsel kind of at first blush, that's that third item there that Kristen has up, that after you've been in jail for days and days and days, a lot of folks are saying, all right, it's clear you can't hire an attorney, we're going to appoint anyway. So I think in that way, counties are kind of roundabout able to aim for compliance. But I think there are counties that are falling short though too.
Yeah. I mean, I could see situations where the person's well over 125%, but they haven't found a lawyer that will take their case for that amount of money. They're sitting in jail. The judge wants the case to move, and ultimately they appoint him a lawyer.
Yeah, I can too. And let me just throw in here, that's why it's important for us, one reason why it's important for us to protect the idea of partial indigence and not discourage it by whatever rule. Because that should apply to a large number of people. And it's I think it's a good solution in a lot of cases. Well, so Alex, what do you want to do?
Well, I don't think we have something here where we can just vote on it,
Right.
but I do want it to go to the full board. Maybe you could, Jeff, you could make this a little more concrete, that it's, I mean, if we do this same thing, your same presentation in front of the board, it's just going to lend itself to another hour-long discussion, which maybe it needs, but it probably also needs some more guidance about like what you actually want it to look like.
And in the meantime, do you think it'd be a good idea for Jeff to talk to Jim Allison and various other people that might have their own perspective on this? I think it would.
I mean, something that looked more like one of those, you know, rules in a local rule. Like this is what it would look like.
Yeah. Draft it up.
Sure, we can certainly draft something, and then yeah, Judge, happy to talk to Jim Allison and maybe John Dayhill and a few others and get their thoughts. And then you know, I mean, we're happy to talk more. I mean, again, it's up to the board how you all want to approach it, but standards and Mr. Bunnan, correct me if I misunderstood the floor thing. I don't want to put words in your mouth on it, but you know, standards are one approach to this. You know, another one is you know, creating guidelines as opposed to an enforceable standard, but having guidelines that we can then really use and maybe create some technology around and really help. Like you said, Judge, I think if counties see the benefits of having a streamlined way to do this, they may just want to go for it anyway. So that's another option.
But I think the beauty of a model is that they would just adopt it out of ease. If you give them something that they don't have to reinvent the wheel, and they go, okay, this is what you think is good. All right, we'll do that.
Right, especially the counties that have 19 pages of qualifications or whatever that county was. Yeah, I think that's true. So who is it in Tarrant County that is most familiar with the living wage calculator?
I think probably Greg Shugart is probably, Wesley and Kristen, does that sound right? The court administrator, Greg Shugart, is he probably the most familiar?
Or Barbara Murphy, the indigent
Barbara
defense
Murphy.
coordinator who works with him. She's
Yes.
more kind of boots on the ground implementing it
Yeah.
through the IDC staff that
Yes.
collects the financial information.
Okay. I think that's a good way to go forward, to make it, as Alex was saying, more concrete, drafted rule that maybe we don't want to vote on right away, but at least have something before the commission to solidify what they're talking about. And in the meantime, see what kind of pushback you think Jim Allison or John Dayhill thinks we would get on this.
Sure.
Okay.
Judge, timeline wise, would it be okay if we started off talking to the counties before drafting? And then, we can aim for something in December, but it may be, just depending on the conversations with the counties, it may be the March board meeting before we bring it back up, if that's okay.
Talk to the counties in anticipation of drafting something.
Well, yeah, that's, I guess what I'm asking in part is, well, it's two questions. One is that before we draft something, would you, I guess, would this committee be okay with us before we actually put pen to paper, talking to the counties first and kind of getting some sense of where their thinking is? I guess is question one.
I think that's fine, but I would rather see it come back sooner than later, just
Right.
because
Sure.
if y'all are going to put more work into this, I want to see what direction y'all ought to be going in.
Yeah,
And at least to get some sense of that at the December meeting.
sure. We can do that.
Does that sound okay?
Yeah, I think that sounds okay. Yeah. Wesley, Kristen, any concerns about that? Does that seem okay?
We can turn it around. It's a little tight with the holidays coming up with Thanksgiving, but we'll get it.
Good.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else we need to cover, Jeff?
Not on our end, unless you all have any other questions or thoughts.
Thanks for all your work on this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's, yeah, a lot of kudos go to Kristen on this. She's done a lot of the heavy lifting. So thank you,
Yeah.
Kristen, for
Thank
all your
you.
good work.
Really good work. Okay, so if nothing